Testament, chapter 10, beginning with verse 32. Remember those earlier days, after you had received the light, when you endured in a great conflict full of suffering. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. At other times you stood side by side with those who were so treated. You suffered along with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property, because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions. So do not throw away your confidence. It will be richly rewarded. You need to persevere, so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what he has promised. For in just a little while, he who is coming will come and will not delay. But my righteous one will live by faith, and I take no pleasure in the one who shrinks back. But we do not belong to those who shrink back and are destroyed, but to those who have faith and are saved. May the Lord's blessing be upon our understanding of this reading of his word. Amen. Well, today we're beginning actually a new series. It's going to go throughout the summer. I'll be using this overall title of You Can't Take It With You. And each week I'll look at something else in terms of a characteristic of us as followers of Jesus. And so today it's faith. You can't take it with you, so live faithfully now. Don't wait for a time to be faithful in the future. Live faithfully now. And each week we'll look at a different Christian characteristic that kind of fits into that category. Well, some years ago, there was a pastor by the name of Harry Emerson Fosdick. He was the pastor of Riverside Church in New York. And while he was the pastor there, he wrote a little book called Faith for Tough Times. Faith for Tough Times. It's a classic because it addresses the concerns that come up within all of us. How am I going to get through, especially when times are tough? How can I keep my faith when it seems like everything is stacked against me? How can I keep my faith in the midst of tragedy, whatever that might be? How can I keep my faith when other people make fun of my faith? How can I be true to my faith? How can I keep my faith when things are really tough? And of course, those concerns are very important, and those are concerns that all of us face at one time or another. But there's another side of that coin that I think we have to look at as well, and that is, how do we keep our faith when times are not tough, when times aren't so tough? How do we keep our faith in the normal, everyday give and take of living? How do we hold on to our faith in the dailiness of life when times are just ordinary? Things are just kind of moving along. Well, the author of the book of Hebrews again and again comes back to this theme. How do we sustain a vibrant faith when things are just ordinary? Now, over the years, I've observed with working with people that, it's amazing how people will rise to the occasion when they're facing some trial, some difficult time. People can often stand up. Their faith really shores them up, allows them to stand strong in the midst of adversity, when tragedy happens, when traumatic things happen. It's oftentimes not the big problems that are our undoing. It's the little things. It's the daily things. It's the tiny annoyances that come our way. It's the routine irritations. You have that nagging problem, whatever it is. It could be, with another person or some issue in your life. It's just that nagging thing. It's those things that so often tear us down. We can handle sometimes the big things pretty well, but the normal everyday things oftentimes are a challenge, and they're the ones that actually take their toll on us. You're all familiar with the saying, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. We're familiar with that one. But there's another side of that sometimes we lose track of. When the going gets easy, even the tough slack off. When things are kind of ordinary, we have a tendency to relax. When the demands are not overly challenging, we just kind of take things for granted. We just go from day to day, just kind of live out the normal routine of life. And for a lot of us, that's what we really wish that we could do. We wish we didn't have to face those tragedies, but we just want things to be ordinary. But sometimes it's in the ordinariness that we lose track of our faith. Sometimes you see that in sports. The Phillies, for instance, they're a good example. When they're playing a tough opponent, when they're playing one of the top teams in baseball, they oftentimes rise to the occasion. They'll do their best. They'll have a great game. In fact, these last two nights, they've been playing the Atlanta Braves. And that first night, on Friday night, they played a great game. They ended up losing in the bottom of the ninth. The pitcher just couldn't hold on and get the save. But now they played a really good game. They just happened to lose. Last night, they were behind going into the later innings, and they came back and they won the game. They can get up for the difficult teams when they're facing them. But so often, if you keep track of the Phillies, when they're playing a team that they're supposed to beat, there should be no question they should beat this team. Those are the ones that are usually the letdown games. And oftentimes they lose to those teams. And I think that's a warning that the writer of Hebrews lays out for us. Beware when things are just ordinary. Beware when no one wants to crucify you. Beware when no hard problem comes your way. Beware when you just kind of drift unchallenged into the ruts of the routine. Your faith may be in greater danger at times like that. There are times, says the writer of Hebrews, when we have to pay attention. We have to pay attention unless we just drift away. It's not when the battle lines are drawn and the trumpets are blaring and the drums are rolling. That's we can get up for those occasions. But when we're going through the everyday ups and downs of life, sometimes that takes its toll. And it's seen in how we treat one another, for instance. How are you when you're paying your bills? How are you when you're in a traffic jam or you're sitting at a traffic light, you're caught in traffic? How are you with the clerk at the grocery store? How are you with the server in the restaurant? How do you respond to your coworkers? How do you treat your children? It's the daily living sometimes that takes its toll on us. Those normal everyday routine things. And then one day we get to the point where we realized, hey, our values have changed. Our values have changed. We become more like the world and the culture around us than like Christians. That's why we have to stay on our toes. That's why we have to be careful. We have to be obedient, even in those normal everyday situations. And so on this day when we celebrate dads and grads, I thought this was an important truth for us to hear. And the writer of Hebrews says some important things for us. How do we live our lives on a day-to-day basis when times aren't so tough? And I think the writer of Hebrews is very helpful, and I think the writer of Hebrews suggests three things. First of all, the original challenge of our discipleship. We have to be aware of that. The second thing is the ongoing commitment of being disciples of Jesus. And then third, the always present cost of discipleship. It costs something to be a disciple of Jesus. We wish it were easier, and sometimes we think it is. Sometimes we live as if it is. We have to be aware, though, of the cost of discipleship as well. So let's look at these three things. First of all, remember the original challenge of discipleship. Right there in that first verse from Hebrews 10:32, it says, remember those earlier days. Remember those earlier days after you had received the light, when you endured in a great conflict full of suffering. Remember those earlier days. Remember where you came from. Remember how it once was. Remember what caused you to make your leap of faith. Remember how God touched you. Remember how you were touched with the good news of Jesus. And I think we all need to hear that advice from time to time because it's so easy to lose our focus. It's so easy to change our focus away from our passion for Jesus and just kind of get into the routine of living. There was a mother who went upstairs into her son's bedroom to wake him up. She said, get up, get ready. It's almost time to go to church. And he pulled the cover up over his shoulders, turned over. He said, I don't want to go today. The mother said, come on, son, we always go to church. He said, I'm tired. You can rest some other time. We need to get to church this morning, she said. And he said, I want to sleep in. Sunday's the only morning I have time to sleep in. You can sleep some other time, she said. We're going to church today. Well, he sat up in bed and he said, give me one good reason that we need to go to church today. His mother said, well, I'll give you three reasons. First of all, it's good for you. Secondly, it's our habit. We go to church every Sunday. And the third thing is, you're the minister. He had lost something along the way. He had lost his commitment. He forgot the original challenge, and how easy that is to happen to us. It's not so much that we turn our backs on our Christian commitment. It's just that we forget it sometimes. It's not that we deny Christ, like Peter did. We don't deny Christ, but sometimes we just kind of ignore him. We haven't so much rejected Christianity. Sometimes we just neglect it. And since we haven't been dramatically challenged, we've lost our sense of purpose. We put our energy into other things that seem to be more pressing in our lives. And I think that's where a lot of people are on their faith journey. We know it's a good thing, but we're so strung out with all the busyness of living that oftentimes we lose our focus and our energies are depleted. We have so many other things that become important to us, that take our attention away from our faith. And so we lose track of the most important thing in our lives, and that's our relationship with God. You know, our faith sometimes gets crowded out by the other things that take our attention. The writer of Hebrews tells us, remember the earlier days. Remember what once challenged you. Remember when Jesus came into your life. Remember how excited you were to have found your Savior. Remember how passionate you were about your faith. I mentioned this already a couple times, but last week we celebrated Pentecost. Remember how we talked about, Peter, who had denied Jesus and then restored in his faith and then stood up and preached this amazing sermon to the people who were gathered there and were wondering what was going on. And he shared the gospel with them. And what did we learn? We learned that 3,000 people came to faith that day. We need to remember the excitement when we come to faith so that we can share that excitement with others. Recall what is the best of you. God has created you to live your best. And so the first thing that Hebrews reminds us of is that original challenge in our lives. The original challenge to discipleship, to become children of God, to live lives as children of God. The second, remember the ongoing commitments of discipleship. What does he say in verse 35? So do not throw away your confidence. Do not throw away your confidence, for it will be richly rewarded. Remember your commitment. Stand for something. If we don't stand for something, we'll fall for everything. And once we have uncovered those important things in life, we need to work hard at holding on to them. Remember that ongoing commitment. And, sometimes it's so much easier to make the great commitment than it is to make the daily one or to live out the daily one. Talking a good game is not going to get it done. That's not enough. We have to live it. We have to grab onto it. We have to celebrate it. We have to follow it. It's easier to make the commitment sometimes than it is to keep the commitment. Just like when you're going on a trip, sometimes it's easier to plan the journey, plan the trip, than it is to follow through and actually live it out. Some years ago, Jim Moore was asked to speak at an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. And he says, he went to the meeting, it was on Tuesday night. He said just before he was introduced, the leader of that meeting asked a gentleman who was in the group to tell his story and share his story of sobriety. The man who was in his 70s spoke about his life and the tragedies that he faced that led him to drinking. And then he ended by speaking of his commitment to being sober. He said, I've been sober now for 14 years, and I'm committed to staying that way. And then he concluded with something very interesting. He said, getting sober is easy. I've done it hundreds and hundreds of times. It's staying sober that counts. Getting sober is easy. It's staying sober that counts. And that's true, isn't it? It's so easy to make commitments. The hard thing is keeping them. And separate from this, and just talking to Ed between services, the first two services, and I mentioned to him, the donuts are out there, and I haven't gone out there yet. I don't know what will happen after this service. They're still supposed to be available after the service, so if you didn't get one, go out and get one. But I mentioned it. I said, I'm trying to eat healthy again, trying to lose some weight. And he brought up to me, he reminded me, yes, just like you said in the message, it's one thing to make the commitment, it's another thing to follow through on it. And that's a great example, isn't it? We all have those things in our lives. We want to make changes. We want to do things. We have it in our minds that we're going to do better. But the The difficulty is the challenge of living that out on a day-to-day basis. And that brings me to the final thing that I think the writer of Hebrews says to us about the challenge of living faithfully, is that there's always a cost. There's always a cost of discipleship. And sometimes that is a real challenge for us. We wish it were easier. The writer of Hebrews says, this is verse 36, you need to persevere. I love that word. You need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what has been promised. You have to persevere. I think that's an appropriate message on this day when we celebrate our graduates, when we celebrate dads. You have to persevere. You don't achieve the level of graduate at any level. You don't achieve that status without persevering, without getting through, without doing what needs to be done. It's true for us as dads, isn't it? We have to persevere. We might not always make the best decisions. We might not always do the right thing, but we have to give our lives to God and allow God to guide us so that we can do our best. We have to persevere. There was a delightful woman. She was up in years. She went to a bookstore and she just saw this small booklet, just a small book. It only cost $0.25. And she bought it and she took it home and she really liked it. So she decided the next day to go back and buy another one to give to a friend. So she went back to the next day, and as the clerk was putting the book in the bag, the woman noticed that it was 35 cents. And she said, but I only paid $0.25 yesterday. And the clerk said, no, the price has been 35 cents. I know, I'm the one who marked them. And so the woman, knowing that this new book she's buying for a friend is 35 cents, she's digging in her purse trying to find another dime. And she found it and she paid for the book and she started to walk away. She didn't get too far, and she turned around and she stepped in front of the next customer and said, wait a minute here, I have to do something. I'm sorry to interrupt, and I'm sorry to be such a bother, but I have to take care of this with this young woman, meaning the clerk. And so the woman put her handbag down and she started to search through her purse as best she could. She said, I hate to be such a bother, but this is important. And so she turned around and smiled at all the customers that were waiting to be waited on, and she couldn't find what she was looking for. She pulled everything out of her purse. Finally, she got into the bottom with both hands, and she comes up with a dime. She finds a dime, and she hands it to the clerk. She says, this is for yesterday. I only paid 25 cents for my booklet yesterday, and so I owe you another dime. And the clerk was like, oh, that's all right. Don't worry about it. She didn't even want to have to deal with it. But the woman said, no, you have to accept it. It's the only honest thing to do. And from behind her, there was a gruff-looking man standing in line. He spoke up. He said, you're right, little lady. It always pays to be honest. The woman said to him, no, it costs to be honest. It just cost me a dime. But Jesus is honest, and I try my best to be like him. And there was a glint of a tear in the eye of the clerk as she rung up that last dime and put it in the cash register from the purchase from the day before. 10 cents, one dime. But I think about that. How do we live out our faith on a daily basis? I love the story, the illustration of, when you go up to the ticket counter, wherever it's at, the theater, the circus, the amusement park, whatever, and it says on the ticket counter that the tickets are one price for a child 5 and under. And then when you're 6 and older, it's another price. It's more expensive. It's cheaper for the 5 and under. And you have a 6-year-old who maybe still looks like a 5-year-old. What do you say? What do you say when you go to the ticket window? I think that seems like a really simple example, but isn't that true? Like, how do we live out our faith? Are we honest? Hey, my grandson's 6. I'm going to pay the price for a 6-year-old. It costs something to be a disciple of Jesus. And I'm not just talking about money. It costs us to stand up for our faith. There are people, and this is getting more and more common, there are people, outside the walls of our church who laugh at those of us who are people of faith. And so we need to stand up. We need to demonstrate God's love in our lives. Honesty costs. Discipleship costs. Christianity costs in ordinary day-to-day living, because it means what that woman knew. It means being like Jesus. It means being like Jesus. And trying to be like Jesus is what takes us from being ordinary to being extraordinary. it's important. It's important. So seize the day. Seize the day. You can't take it with you, so live faithfully now. Live faithfully now. Let's pray. Lord, we just pray that we might indeed be people of faith. And we know that, we can get up for the tough things in life. We get that bad diagnosis, or we're having trouble in our relationships.